What is lent to you? It's a description of how the world works.
So I think Sacha wants to start. So what do you think why money matters?
Well, so actually we already heard really interesting talks this morning, and which partly covered some of the stuff I was going to allude to, and maybe just to pick up on what Steve Keen said earlier this morning, why money matters. I think it's really crucial if you look at mainstream macro modeling, and like you said, when I went, so I studied in different universities and actually never heard about the concept. I was only exposed to post-Keynesian economics actually after graduating, and a lot more makes sense when you think about it this way. As Steve also said, all these puzzles that you see. And I worked after university. I started working at the ECB and Bundesbank. Now I'm. And when you go to these mainstream macro conferences, there's always so many puzzles. And with a little bit of common sense, most of these puzzles would simply disappear. And things become a lot more plausible. And without making it more complicated, I very much subscribe to what you said. I mean, when you just look at identities, like savings equals investment, basically what you learn in Macro 101, that certainly holds true, but the causality is just from the reverse, right? You don't need savings to invest, but once you get a loan in order to undertake investments, savings are created in the same moment. Right now the challenge is, how do you incorporate that in modern macro models? Because basically when you, and correct me when I'm wrong, but from how I understand, when you had after the post Bretton Woods system, you had these competing schools. You had Kalecki and Cambridge with like very reasonable business cycle models, and then Solow, of course, was a smart guy. Well, his growth model, which basically relies on that flawed misconception on savings and investment because money is absent, that just became the predominant scheme in neoclassical economics, providing the base for basically all of modern macro, quantitative macro models, DSGE models. Now, when you talk to DSGE people, who are very smart people and usually really well intentioned, work with them all the time, they just don't really think about it. And once they would start thinking about it, they would have to completely reconsider their entire education. All these years of educational investment that they have put into it. It's too bad that Peter Bofinger is not here, because one of his colleagues at the Council of Economic Advisors in Germany, who's responsible for monetary policy, he has these huge DSGE database, from which, and in none of these models, money is modeled accurately. And actually, when my colleague pointed out to him, after that Bundesbank paper came out, how money is created, he was saying, well, also the Bundesbank is sometimes wrong. So there's like the orthodoxy by itself, but it's just, and it's not. I mean, it can't be an intellectual challenge because it's not that hard to understand. But I think it's really just that vested, all these years you have put into it, all these brain power, and it's funny, like at the central banks, also the IMF, you have these weekly research seminars, which are usually quite stimulating, and not all of mainstream economics is useless, of course. So there's lots of really interesting applied macro empirical stuff, microeconometrics. But when you look at DSG modeling, you have these people coming in, calibrating their models, having new perturbations, and they invest so much time and energy into something which is completely flawed from the core. It's and once sometimes I just raise my hand, and sometimes they have money in it, sometimes they don't. When they have money in it, it's usually in the way that households have to forego consumption, right, in order to bring it to the banks if you have financial intermediaries, and then these banks can lend out to firms who maximize their profits. And when you ask the question, well, where does money come from? They basically stare at you blank. It's just not. Sometimes you have a growth function from the central bank, which would, suppose you actually have a constant money multiplier. That this might somewhat of a reasonable assumption, but it's not, though. Especially when you need it at the zero lower bound, at the effective lower bound, when the money multiplier correlation collapses. That's when these models become completely useless in predicting what's going to happen or in formulating policy advice. So I think now the challenge becomes, where do we go forward? And I think it's very encouraging right now when you look at Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, for example, who's one of her main economic advisors is actually Stephanie Kelton. So in the policy sphere, you get some of these concepts because it's intuitively appealing, I think, to a lot of people without going into the money details. So you have somewhat in the policy realm already going on. Now, what's going on in academia? And I think I again have to agree very much with what Steve said, that essentially there's somewhat more openness at central banks and international institutions like the World Bank or also the IMF, where you have sort of like a safe job. You don't have that pressure to publish in mainstream journals all the time. So there's somewhat more of a free thinking, and also you just look at reality, right? And that's why I think what you said this morning, what you found appealing about modern monetary theory, that it's actually not so much of a theory, but just a factual description of reality, right? So I think the theory maybe does a disservice to the concept, because it's simply, without the normative part, of course, what government should or should not do. It's a simple factual description of reality. And I think what is very promising avenue to pursue is to take these articles from very orthodox institutions like the Bank of England, Bundesbank. Kumhoff had this has a great blog entry called "The Truth About Banks" on the IMF website, I think from 2016, which summarizes this very succinctly, and yet it hasn't really found its way into IMF policy advice. But I think that's what you can take and say, well, this is just how it works, and quantitative macro guys need to catch up. Like it's basically, and that's, I think, once you ask them really simple questions, you get a lot of people thinking. You know, if you say, well, banks can only lend if they collect savings, just ask them, well, where do people get savings from, right? And it becomes very circular very quickly. And I invested a little bit of time last summer, for example, to edit the German Wikipedia on it, which was terrible, just plain out terrible. And they still had an old reference to the money multiplier, which was in the Blanchard-Illing textbook, which actually took it out in the last edition. So I think it's still not really embedded yet, but I think that's something where you have to start with young students in textbooks, just get these crazy concepts out of there, and then students will start to think for themselves, I think. And I think for lay people, I mean, whatever Wikipedia you're using, also the English one isn't particularly great, but it's a little bit of work, but it's quite rewarding. This is just factual descriptions of reality, right? It's not, this shouldn't even be debated, right? This is just to be accepted, and then you can say, well, how large should the deficit be, or what is the government spending money on? Of course, we don't want the government spending on fancy cars for the ministers or whatever, but I think that's the debate one should have, and not whether this is true or not.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for your statement. So the next statement?
Yes, my next statement. My statement. My name is Elisabeth Springler. I'm from Austria, and I would like to give a more Austrian perspective, but not in a sense of an economic school, but rather from a geographic reference. I perfectly agree with the theoretical foundations that we had today, because I think that I can also agree with what you said, that it's of course very intuitive, that we try to explain what the real world is around, but I disagree in the sense that it's already common sense for many politicians in economic policy. I think you mentioned somehow that it should be translated. From two perspectives. From the one side, as I'm also a member in the fiscal council in Austria for debt mechanisms, and in the stability board for financial stability, which was created after the banking union, I somehow feel that they're not always on my side, whether contradiction holds in some cases. But for me, what I want to focus a little bit more is on the empirical evidences that we've seen in some other markets. So far, we talked a lot on the pure effects of macroeconomic modeling. So I want to focus how we see what we try to model there in a real world in one sector, and this is for me the housing sector. Because that is I think for me the perfect example how we see that what we try to explain is visible, and somehow the current macroeconomic situation and mainstream economics try to put the argument around so their mainstream fantasy of liberalization of the financial market still holds. And I want to tell you why. So the puzzling thing here is Austria, because Austria's housing market was always regarded to be a very, very stable housing market. With not a lot of house price increases, not a strong rent increase. And before the financial bubble and the burst of the bubble and then the financial crisis, we have seen those stable prices. Unlike most southern European economies where we've seen those housing bubbles, especially in Spain, and we all blame them that they went through this financialization process and suddenly they had lots of securitization on the market, and that was the reason for the housing bubble. But then what happens afterwards was that we used monetary policy, and this is where money matters comes in. We used monetary policy to somehow offset the negative elements of the financial crisis, and as we've seen, once we want to spur inflation, that means that has to increase somehow. On whose back is that really taken out? And this is carried out on the household's back. So this is what we see now in Austria, because whenever we had this asset purchase program, which was not sterilized anymore, we see that suddenly house prices, especially after 2012, started to increase tremendously. And nobody couldn't explain why should that happen in Austria. And at the same time, also the rents started to increase. Approximately 1 year later, or let's say 18 months later. So what we see now is a very dynamic housing market, not only in Vienna, but the whole of Austria for the ownership and the rents. So when we try to dig a little deeper, what happened according to that loose monetary policy is, for me, the example of a very strong financialization process, which was undertaken in the same time, and means that we have changed something on the underlying institutional structure. So for me, this means that monetary policy is somehow also used to give a new area of freedom so that households can really fulfill what we see, what's happening in those macro models. When we see in the macro models that households should increase their debt positions, we have to ask ourselves, how could that be done? So at the same time, some policy implementations have to be fulfilled, that this macro models, as we see it's forthcoming and as holds, is still working. And it's working that way. So somehow it's the proof of the underlying macro model, but we don't like the result. Because the result means that this increase in house prices means that on the one hand we have an increase in home ownership rates. This is somehow the first step towards financialization, from a very strong rental sector to an increase in homeowners. And that means that Austria is lagging behind that. Many other European economies did that step before, already in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, when financialization started. But in Austria we still have approximately 55 to 60% renters. So what we aim for, and this is also what politicians are now carrying us to do, is you have to choose your own prosperity in the future, so become a homeowner. And the underlying financial spectrum gives you all the opportunities. So the opportunities are carried out at the same time as our loose monetary policy gives us the possibility also to take out a loan at a lower interest rate. So if we really do that, that means that in this case we get an incentive from the central bank, but we are really the ones who are then increasing our demand. And as increase in demand then works, still, that's true, we have prosperity because we know that the housing sector is the main driving force for a business cycle. It leads to the boom phase in Austria. We have strong investments, not only in the whole area of housing, but all other areas as well. But at the same time, we see that the first step is done already. So a lot of households are becoming homeowners. They try to increase the homeownership rate. But then there is also the second stage. And also the second stage is somehow transmitted via monetary policy, because that means we have a new area of speculative demand, which is not the so-called primary demand that we have with our households, which is already fulfilled with this deep and strong increase in interest rates. But parallel to that, and that's what we see especially in Austria and in Vienna, is that the speculative derived demand increases. And that means it's not a primary house for housing anymore, but we have lots of empty flats around there, but we start speculating on that. And that drives up house prices another time. So those who are rich already, and they become richer again. So the whole situation means that loose monetary policy in the end has a positive impact for the strong negative distribution effects that we have. And financialization on the other means that those households who are already lagging behind have to increase their debt ratios so that they have their primary demand fulfilled. They are not profiting on the derived demand, on speculative demand. So the combination of loose financial markets and also the shift in the national financial system that we see, and when we are now opting for a new capital union in the European Union, that means, of course, that financial sectors and the underlying financing structure moves towards a more liberal financial sector again. Again, gives more possibilities and opportunities to invest, and for those households to rise and build up their debt positions again. So what we end up now is a dynamic housing market with approximately 12% increase annually of house prices. And we had some years when we also had like very strong fluctuations, rents increasing 8%, 10%. It always depends how the underlying structure is. So far, we are not fulfilling the the German model, because the German model already said increasing the free liberal rental sector. So Austria is not doing that at the moment because we have a very strong non-profit housing sector. And this non-profit housing sector is really pushing down a little bit the rents. But we are moving towards the German model, abolishing more non-profit sector, because that's not fitting in the politicians' opinion of having our own possibilities to create prosperity in the future. Because obviously the state is not doing that. And if the state is not increasing that, then we have to do that. Because otherwise our model shows that it's not working in any other case. And it's true, the politicians seem not to know that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for these two perspectives, which fit together very nicely. So I think it's kind of clear that money matters to every person. And if I can basically jump from your talk back to Steve's talk, I mean, what you are basically saying is that if you want to spend money, you have to somehow create money, and of course you can create that by private debt. So of course one way to kick off an economy is basically to increase private debt. And how do you do this? Well, you try to increase some kind of speculative feeling in the economy, so that you basically try to get house prices up. You can politically manipulate a bit. In Germany, for example, the allowance that Hartz IV people get, so those who are long-term unemployed and other people who are falling below the minimum wage, if they have a flat, then they can get more money now than they got 5 years ago. So this of course helps to increase rents, because it shifts up the level of those who are the poorest. And then you are basically creating this kind of institutional framework which allows you to run your economy on ever increasing house prices. Even Paul Krugman noted that once, I think probably like 10 years ago by now, that the American bubble is run, or the American economy is run by a bubble in the housing market where Americans get rich by selling each other houses at ever higher prices. Okay, so even a figure like Paul Krugman understands that. So the question is now. So the question, of course, is if the monetary economy is based on increases in spending, and it's based on increases in debt, the question is, of course, who has to carry the debt? So from the perspective of the economy, should it be the public sector? Should it be the private sector? Should it be companies, households? And of course, what we are seeing right now in Austria, and we've seen that in Germany as well, is that basically the institutions have been reworked in order to make it possible for private households to load up with debt, because the firms, they have surpluses, so they don't want to borrow, and that of course is something which I think is connected to of course the macroeconomic situation as such. So one question I have to you is, Elisabeth, what is the Fiscal Council in Austria talking about? Can you tell us anything about that? That sounds very interesting.
Well, that's like in every member state of the European Union, there has to be now this fiscal advisory board and council talking about the debt of and the deficit situation of the public sector. So we are quite happy, of course, that the interest rates are decreasing that much, because Austria was definitely profiting a lot, because with that lower interest rate level they could diminish the deficit, and that's why we are within the frame of the MTO, the medium-term objective, and can meet the criteria. But nevertheless, the positions framed within the council are, of course, that several institutions are putting members up to that council, and that's how the opinions are split up. So the Chamber of Commerce has a different opinion than the Chamber of Labor, so that's how it's transmitted also in that advisory board. So in the end, it's kind of a watchdog to keep up with the criteria and the guidelines set up by the growth and stability mechanism, and the implementation of 2-pack and 6-packs of the European Union. So somehow they have to guide through the protective and the preventive arm of the stability and growth pact.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. Well, to Sacha, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the textbook by Blanchard and Illing, because some years ago I was at a workshop here, financed by the unions, and there was also Mr. Illing was there present. And then some student got up and said, "Look, your monetary theory in your textbook is completely wrong." and everybody was like, yeah, it's completely wrong. And he said, well, if that's the case, I should take it out. Okay, this is like saying, you know what, you people in the Christian church, in your Bible, it's not really clear historically that God ever existed. And then the Pope says, well, we'll take him out, we'll write him out of the Bible. Okay, I mean, to do macroeconomics without talking about money, it's ridiculous. I mean, what kind of exercise is this? We're living in the 21st century. And of course, the role that money plays is very important. So what might be then different, or what might be difficult? Different setups to the one that you described. What could we do instead of piling up private debt more? Because I mean, private debt. The problem is if asset prices go down at some point, like they did in Spain, Ireland, US. So we've seen that happen quite a lot. So it always means you get into some kind of recession. Debts are not going to be repaid. People will be losing their houses. They will be out in the streets while the houses are empty. Is there any alternative to this kind of economic policy?
Well, I think the underlying thing is that there is still a lot of ideology behind that, but it just doesn't mean anymore that the state should do it, but currently it's like every private person should do it. So when we go back to the equation, we would just say, like, shift it backwards and say, well, also the state should be allowed to have a lot more responsibility for those what we are aiming for, and what we are aiming for is more or less to have a setup of a kind of a welfare system, because what we should count for is every citizen. So if that is our frame and our economic policy, and then we think who has then to put up with some responsibility, then I come back and say, well, some kind of state should do it, so we should reframe our institutional setting again, so that it's not the case that every individual should pile up that. But there should be a little bit more control and production of housing in the case of the housing sector. So shouldn't be left to the speculative demand, but to production of affordable housing, and that should be the public sector's incentive as well, with different cases coming from like the weakest form should be then a public-private partnership, and the strongest form could be a total public provision of housing, as we had it also till the beginning of the 2000s also in Austria. So that was the time when we started to abolish the direct production of provincial housing production by provinces and cities. So till that was also common. So that's now all left to non-profit organizations. and that's always in discussion if they should still exist. So when we reverse that spiral, then I think we can't do anything in closing our financial sector. I mean, we can't do that. We are connected, and within international corporations and global mechanisms of financial markets, I think it's a very nice idea, but it's not very forthcoming to think that Austria, somehow on an island, can just shut down all the interrelations on the financial sector with anybody else. So if that's not possible, then we should opt to the other turning point, and that's for me the institutional structure.
And you mentioned, I think, the reforms of the European Union. So now what is allowed in the European Union is securitization, which was not allowed before. So, I mean, if you look at the IMF, I mean, the IMF probably wants to understand where's the risk, okay? So there's a lot of loans outstanding, and then there probably are some non-performing loans, like in Italy and in other places in Europe, in Spain probably. So is it not very complicated that when the European Union allows for securitization, which means that banks can sell off loans to other banks, that then the risks are spread around? I mean, they're not gone. So is it not harder or do you have any opinion on that? Whether it's possible then for the IMF to predict where the next crisis will hit, because you are now selling off the loans to some places where you don't see them, basically.
The question is for me?
Yes.
I think she's
your private answer.
Actually, I found your previous question a lot more interesting. So maybe I'll just add to that, and if you still want an answer to the second one, I can briefly discuss that one. On I think the perspectives for debt and growth, I think that's really the issue here, because in the current system, they are inherently intertwined, as Steve has also put out. You know, it's an integral part of what you have to look at in terms of aggregate demand. Now, one proposal, of course, by Michael Kumhoff was go back to the Chicago plan, separate. There's also a good paper by Roman Beresville from the Swiss National Bank about the separation of money and credit, where you basically would go to they had this initiative last year in the referendum, where basically you would actually put central banks in charge of money creation, and I'll give a brief talk about that this afternoon. Some shameless self-promotion. But in the current system, where money is created exclusively by commercial banks when they extend loans, then of course you can't discouple the two of them, and then the debate has to be about the quality of debt. So that maybe pertains to your second question, because what we've seen over the last 20-30 years essentially is basically that bank lending has increasingly gone to housing market, to mortgage lending, and and increasing share to productive investment. And from that results, of course, one-to-one, your debt to GDP dynamics, because investment if you give a loan for investment or consumption, with investment obviously being better, that directly has an impact on GDP in that year and possible knock-on effect. So you wouldn't see a change in the debt to GDP ratio. Whereas when you give a loan for existing real estate, which can make sense, and if from an intertemporal perspective for people to buy a house or whatever, then it doesn't enter GDP instantaneously and only very indirectly. So it increases your debt to GDP ratio. And a lot of what we've seen now is that those loans are not usually for first-time homeowners. That's not really what's driving the market then, but it's there's a lot of speculative activity. Secondly, if it goes to first-time homeowners, if you look at the U.S., that usually made up for stagnating real wages, right? So I think inequality is a big part of this discussion. Why we see these increasing shares of debt to GDP, and once you start addressing that again through, for example, more progressive tax systems, estate taxes, you immediately address the need for ever-increasing leverage for lower and middle-income households. So I think that's these debates should be closely linked with one another. Then on the point you briefly mentioned about going back to the textbook, because actually Professor Illing is my PhD supervisor, so I was trying to redraft large sections of that book last year, and it's just a lot of work. I mean, you have to redraft it from the bottom up, and to give them credit, I think, and also to give Krugman credit, at least they engage, and they think about it at least, and there's a lot of people who refuse to think about it, and as you said, he's open. He's like, okay, if if this is wrong and maybe you don't give too much thought to it, as most economists do in university, just tax along. There's no ill intention. So I think it's the mark of an academic to say, well, if the facts change, I change my mind. If you learn something, you change it. But so we were trying to switch it a lot. I think his main take was, well, this is easy for pedagogical reasons. This is easy to understand. I'm like, well, it's actually the Bundesbank has for high school students. They have a book where they explain money creation in very simple terms. So that's not the issue. And plus, you shouldn't teach something just because it's easy if it's wrong, right? So, but then, secondly, of course, if you really are serious about changing that section, apparently Professor Blanchard is right now redrafting that money section on which the book is oriented. But if he's really serious about it and he takes this on board, then basically he also has to discard large swaths of the rest, and also a lot of his research which was based on that view of either money neutrality or constant money multiplier, and base and broad money are essentially the same thing. So I like what you said about base money, that it's actually a misnomer because broad money isn't in any way based on it. But I think this is a long and lengthy process, but I think it's a good way once you have this factual description of reality, how money is created, you can change a lot of narratives about policy making, about monetary and fiscal policy. So I think this is more important than the securitization questions.
You just want to,
let me come back to the securitization issue. When you think of who's receiving financing from for housing, then so it's housing organizations or individuals. So it's not only a question of pure individuals and private households receiving here additional money, but it's also the fact of other organizations, private investors receiving more money, and this is going to be sold off and securitized. So what we experienced in the past was as well that whenever you have a lot of liberal markets on the financial spectrum, that you have an increase in non-performing loans. And what we did in the last years was that when we thought about macroprudential regulation, we tried to see how the symbiotic thing between several markets is. And then we now try to figure out that Austrian banks, for example, may be quite hit by some downturn in Central and Eastern Europe, then that is the macroeconomic approach. If that is not securitized within the European Union, you don't see that clearly anymore, because you don't see anymore what is sold off to Germany, you don't see it clearly what is their own bank balance when it's in Central and Eastern Europe. And all the efforts that you did so far to diminish non-performing loans seem to be not that effective anymore. So for me, whenever you talk about financial stability, not necessarily in the housing sector, but also in the banking sector, I think selling off and securitization means 2 steps back to what we have achieved right now, because in the last 5 to 6 years, the European Union incentives and all the member states' incentives was that you should have a strong the linkage of macroprudential regulation. Try to see what is the tier 1 capital in reality. Does that fit to this combination of risks that banks really hold? And again, in the case of Austria, is we're an overbanked economy, and therefore for us that's tremendously important to look at daughter companies and other interrelations to member states of the European Union. So that's. And I'm not from the IMF, so I can speak freely.
Well, I can bring in Warren Rosler, who once wrote a paper on financial regulation, and he said securitization has no public purpose, so it should not be allowed. So if a bank makes a loan to some person, well, it's good that the bank still has it on the books, because if that person or firm does not repay the loan, then you can see the financial condition of the bank deteriorating. And that is kind of what you would want to have in a capitalist economy, that those banks who are not taking care of their loans, and they give loans too freely or too cheaply or to people who cannot afford to repay anyway, that these banks then have financial problems. But if you basically give a bad loan to somebody, a liar loan maybe, where the documentation is basically wrong or false or falsified, or even it's criminal activity, and then you're selling off the loan to somebody, rewrapping it like it happened in the last financial crisis with the collateralized debt obligation, then of course it's very confusing, and it's not clear what is cause and effect. So of course when we discuss the monetary system, we have to discuss these institutions and whether we allow some sales to be made or not. And I mean, one of the things that you could keep in mind, which is Warren Mosler's idea, is that you always have to think about the public purpose. So is it good for the profits of the bank? That's not so important. The important question is, do we improve the economy by this? So are we better off? Are we better off by having banks selling loans they don't like to other banks? And, well, I mean, this is like saying I have a huge heap of junk in my backyard and I just shift it to my neighbor's backyard. Are we better off as society? No, we're not. Okay, so are there any thoughts at the IMF or at the Fiscal Council basically to reorient policy and say we don't want to do what is profitable, but we want to try to build institutions that benefit the public purpose? Is there any change in the conversation over the last 2 years?
Maybe I have a slightly different view on what you just said. And again, I would like to refer to Steve, what he said. I mean, capitalism is a marvelous thing in providing, it can generate a lot of welfare, innovation, progress, growth, and it has to work for everybody, right? So I'm all in favor of strong regulation and strong social welfare nets, and certainly there have been excesses, but rather than somebody having, I'm a bureaucrat, right? I work in these institutions, and rather than having these bureaucrats decide on what should be done and what not, I think you can let banks do securitization and let them do what they like, but just have really high equity ratios so that if they have losses, they bear the brunt themselves. I mean, in the Chicago plan, basically all investment vehicles would be equity only, so you have a direct bail-in. And I think that was the problem in the last financial crisis, that banks were just massively undercapitalized, and then taxpayers had to step in and rescue them. But I see there's a financial stability expert from Bundesbank sitting over there, so maybe he also has some good points to offer. And I think there's also some sessions on bank equity over the course of these 2 days. But I think that's my personal take on it. Generally, I think there's a strong move, of course, to make the financial system more resilient. But I would be somewhat more reluctant to outright ban certain things, because then you get into all kinds of social planners, what's socially beneficial, whatnot, and rather have try to have a resilient financial system with high equity buffers and progressive taxation systems such that bankers don't go home with. I heard this anecdote about Davos 2 weeks ago. I think it was a hedge fund manager, when he heard about the 70% marginal tax rate proposal above 10 million. He was really concerned about himself, that he might not only get to keep 300 million of his additional 1 billion. So I think this is the stuff we should be talking about. Let them do their thing, and if they do risky stuff, they take the losses.
Oh, well, let me answer briefly to the second part as well. When we think about the regulation of the financial market, and we heard a lot about Minsky and thought about re-regulation, then to me, of course, it's from a post-Keynesian perspective, always should be stronger asset-based regulations. And what we have so far with Basel 2, 3, and so forth is not asset-based, but it's again focusing on the risk of the borrower and then building up on the tier 1 equity ratios, which is not asset-based but the risk of the borrower. So that should be the first step towards a complete change in the system. But the even more important question to me always is, what is the financial market aiming for? What you said, that should be then a shift again in the ideology that we have, because so far all the mechanisms that we are undertaking is to diminish the riskiness of the system, but let them do what they like to do in case of earning money and not whom they are profiting. So it is the question of, do we want to use the financial sector to do something that we are all better off, or do we want to diminish the riskiness of the financial sector itself? And I think that is a completely different question that we have to address. When we want to shift the meaning of the financial system, then we also have to shift the financial regulation and change the underlying system. When we just want to make sure that those who earn tremendously lot money out of the system also pay higher taxes, then we add up some new changes into the existing sector, existing things like the progressive income tax, so that those are not earning too much. We are not changing the aim of the financial sector as it is right at the moment, and that means creating profits for its own sake and not for the sake of this civil society or for the households or for whomever it should be. So that's on us to define. And I think that's also the thing that macroeconomists should clearly address and should not step back on that, because to me it's always important not to hide behind the model only, but also transmit what the meaning is for the civil society or for us. So coming then back to your first question, let me put it like that. These councils are always resembling also what the voters are aiming for, because they are somehow set up after the elections, and then after some time, when there were re-elections in between, there is also a new setup of the whole council. So that means that also, of course, the discourses might change over time due to voters' opinions of who should be in power in the countries. So there's going to be a new change also in Austria, of course, in the next months.
Oh yeah, okay.
For the system.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely not in that council anymore.
Oh, okay, sorry to hear that.
No.
We're glad to have you here now. So. Okay, so I think that connects somehow back to Steve Keen again, because you said that capitalism is important because the private sector can be so innovative and it has to be financed somehow. I think that is basically the nexus that we're talking about here. So we want the financial sector. I think we all agree on that. But they have to be judged by the results in the real economy. And this is, of course, something which we have to think about as society. So how do we get the results in the real world, and not instead of getting one financial bubble after the other.
That's three.
Or three. Okay, that's three. How do we get that? And I would like to open the floor now for the last 20 minutes, I think, for questions and comments from the floor. Yes.
I think of housing as a public purpose. I was thinking, should governments not have a buffer stock of housing to keep prices down, as well as housing people, in the same way that we view a job guarantee to provide a price floor? We can use our house guarantee to provide a maximum, to stop the prices going too high, to discourage people from then buying places just to rent, ever increasing, as a price stability as well as a public purpose. Wouldn't that not be worth thinking about?
I think you can directly answer to that.
Well, according to me, that would definitely be a very good idea, because at the same time it also would mean that whenever you have some kind of public funding going into the housing sector and public provision, it should go into the production of the housing, production of cheap housing, instead of providing additional money for a household to go into the private rental sector, because that's just driving up rents. So that we have learned in the last years, and always the bad example has been Great Britain, where we've seen that only many years or decades ago, but nevertheless, there are many studies showing that overall the total public amount that has to go in money that has to go into the social security, whatever, connected to housing is much higher when you go into this so-called subjective-based things where you provide it directly to the households. Step by step, all governments and economies are moving towards that system. So also Austria is doing that for the last years. Increasing the idea that the rent should be diminished by households having an additional fraction for housing cash in their hands. That's not reducing speculation, but it's just aiming that households are richer now, so we can ask more money. And the fraction of money that is spent by households is increasing continuously over the last years.
Can I just play devil's advocate on this one? because actually I would hold a different opinion. I agree that we have massive problems in the housing market, and that a lot of people find it really hard to find affordable housing, but I don't think rental caps, putting it on basically private landlords, putting it on them, is going to help that much. Again, it's a lot of intervention.
Yeah,
and
I
actually,
wasn't suggesting rental cap. I was suggesting a buffer stock of housing. So that it's different.
okay. Oh,
because that goes exactly in that direction that we are not, that we don't want.
Oh, okay.
So if there's a price crash, there's somewhere for people to go where they can rent from the state.
Oh, I see. Well, I think Vienna is a great example. I think 40% of the overall housing in the city is publicly owned, or and
Yeah,
that
that's
keeps rented.
the housing stock, but there is no new housing provision anymore. So, but nevertheless, that is always supposed to be the reason why rents, compared to other big cities, are still quite low
Exactly.
compared to that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, when we see the difference between the dynamics of the publicly owned part and the private owned part, we see that this dynamic is increasing in the privately owned part. And as we have an increase in population in Austria, and those people who are like, partly of them are not really rich, and we see that also with the what everybody called migration crisis, whatever we don't call it, we just have a strong inflow of population. And those people coming are mostly those who are not very, very rich and have a high income, so they go again into the sector of the publicly owned stock, which puts a lot more pressure on that part and drags out those people who are on lower middle income, who don't fit into the publicly owned part anymore, and then suddenly they're in the open market. And they can't afford those rents in the open market. So we should increase the publicly owned stock, or whatever kind of affordable stock, so that we don't have these social gaps in the population anymore.
Completely agree with that.
Okay. Yeah.
I find it very interesting what you said about the housing and possible bubble speculative aspect. I would like whether you could address that. First of all, this buffer stock thing, I don't think it really works from a German perspective. We have a lot of buffer stock in the eastern part of Germany. The problem is that the people where the shortages is somewhere else, right? People don't migrate just to a buffer stock and move to another city. But what of this is really a bubble? Also with respect to Germany, I see a kind of also a real resource shortage, right? The supply shortage. I know from communities that desperately create or try to create affordable housing, and I've seen prices going up by 40%, which is not necessarily speculative. It's just that the suppliers can basically, due to a shortage of manpower, ask for such prices. The next thing is, what do you think? So, what is speculative?
Yes.
Where do we see something with MMT, and where is it real? And isn't the communities often supporting this development? I know of communities, due to this kind of crazy balanced budget, even on the community level, they speculate on increase in land prices. I know communities that openly say, if you talk to them, we hope to get rid of them on time, and so on and so forth. And secondly, and this is even a criticism maybe that could be addressed to the left and green left in Germany and other countries, that the artificial shortage is created by saying basically we have to the land, additional landscaping is not affordable due to ecological reasons and so on. And doesn't that also create a real aggregate supply part problem?
There were lots of questions. I tried to cover that. The first part was the bubble question part. What we see is also the Austrian central bank. So again, central bankers are doing a lot of research, as we have heard now the whole day. So they created a so-called fundamental price index on the housing sector, with exactly the aim to figure out, is that already a bubble? But the bubble again means bubble for the housing, for the financial sector. So what it is not a bubble for the financial sector, because the result was that those who go into home ownership and pay those higher prices are still the richer households. So those who profit from low interest rates and have a higher income, they profit from the changes in the housing market, and they even drive up the prices. So from this perspective, we are safe, because we are not creating a bubble in the financial term. We are rather creating a social negative bubble, and that is driven by a high percentage of what you just said, that those who are supposed to provide affordable housing can hardly do that because they are facing, on the one hand, a lot of other like legal obligations they have to fulfill, so they have to do everything. They have to do sustainable housing, environmental sustainability, like social, and they have to are not allowed to put up whatever rent they like. It's just the cost should be covered. At the same time, the land increases. So that's exactly what you said. Those communities who are selling land are speculating on land because they have to fulfill, again, the Growth and Stability Pact. And also the inner Austrian Growth and Stability Pact means that they have to save even more to support the public administrative part. So they can't escape from that spiral as well. So they have to prove that they are doing whatever they can. So they sell it at a already speculative price already, and those like land parts which are still available, they are getting like diminished, or they are on the outskirts. But if they're in the outskirts, they create a higher public cost again because you need street lamps, whatever. Like, so again, the costs are transferred and transmitted to the next generations or the next years. So we have that. We experience all that in different countries, in different cities, also in throughout Austria. But the thing is that whenever you have, again, those limited profit housing organizations are the ones in Austria at the moment who have to bear all that. And if they can't do that anymore, then we are into the more German system when we abolish that non-profit organizational structure, move towards another structure, and that means then there is no rent control, let's say, because there's even less provision in housing. So what I think there have to be a huge bunch of measures have to be taken, starting already from the land costs, and who is saving that and who is speculating on that in the future. And so it's not only private households who own that land, it's also the public who owns that land. And it's a big issue also in Austria, so in Vienna.
Can I just add to that? If, I would be curious if Steve would have another suggestion for Growth and Stability Pact, because that's essentially also doing the opposite of what I have done.
I've just actually seen from Vito Constanzo a statement that thinks they should renegotiate the Maastricht Treaty, and have that coming out of a member of the ECB board is probably the most positive development I've seen in the European Union in the last 10 years. Whether it will lead to anything I don't know, but it's at least it's a glimmer of hope. So, but otherwise, as you know, I'm a very strong critic of the euro. And in that case, I stand on the left-wing shoulder of Wayne Godley and the right-wing shoulder of Milton Friedman.
Right. I thought maybe you have another nice.
You recognise that Senor Constancio recently was replaced with Luis de Guindos.
Oh, that's why he's talking up. Okay.
You can answer.
Oh no, that's all I had to add to that. I don't like to hear it's such an oxymoron. It always like when I hear stability and growth back, and it's doing the exact opposite. It's just
It is opposite.
Yeah.
Let's not get into that.
Yeah.
Okay, more questions over there?
Yeah, I mean, I question your claim that macroeconomics ignores money, because the father of macroeconomics, i.e. Keynes, wrote a lot about money, and his general theory was partly about money, and he gave huge role to money through liquidity preference in clogging the system up by deflating necessary demand. And we also claim that investment was not, as you say, was not generated by savings. Au contraire, it was created by consumption or expected consumption. That's why firms invest. So that seems to me to be quite parallel, actually, with what modern monetary theory is saying. If investment is driven by savings, neither is money. They're both created by consumption. So that's one point. The other point is that the claim that savings never creates money, isn't there another route by which it might, i.e. savings goes into pensions and to insurance funds, and it's the pension and insurance funds that were largely the provider of money through QE, because quantitative easing, certainly in the UK, was achieved by the central bank buying government bonds back off the pension and insurance companies in return for cash, who then rolled it on to buy back get more government bonds to give that money back into government use. And so the only reason that the pension investment funds have got such huge funds as they have is due to savings. So isn't that another route by which actually savings might be creating money by driving the QE process through the pension and investment funds.
Maybe I can answer that
Sure.
before.
Yeah.
leave
Of
the
course,
rest
you
of you.
have a place to do it.
So John Maynard Keynes in his general theory writes in the introduction, monetary detail falls into the background. Okay, so it's one of the points that he makes. If you look at the treatise on money in the 2 volumes of 1930, the first 6 pages he says he's a chartalist, so he writes about NAP. But somehow in the English tradition of post-Keynesianism, all of this was forgotten. So Robert Skidelsky doesn't have even an entry on NAP or chartalism in his biography, never talks about it. So in Germany this is more known because Knapp was a German, probably. So yes, of course, John Maynard Keynes writes in the general theory, I think it's chapter 2 or 3, that basically it's not that savings create investment, but it's the other way around, so he's already got it clear. So yeah, that's a pretty good book. I agree. Okay, so MMT is more, it adds more monetary detail. That's how I would put it. And of course, it expands more on the chartalist thing. Can savings create investment?
Preference is core to Keynes.
Sorry?
Liquidity preference is core to Keynes.
Yeah, but we don't. Most MMTers don't agree with that. Okay, so they see it as secondary. But we can talk about it in the break probably. It's more of a specialist discussion. But your second question about savings create investment. Well, if I give my money to some kind of investment fund, they buy an existing asset. Okay, that will not lead to investment. It leads to financial investment, but when we talk about macroeconomics, by investment we mean investment in capital assets, in physical assets, like building a house. So this means we have this post-Keynesian idea that you have initial finance, you have final finance. So once you want to build a house, you get a loan from the bank, and then somebody might buy that loan, which is then securitized. But the second person buying the securitized loan is not creating investment, even though that person is saving. Okay, so we make this distinction, which I think is very useful to understand that one is about the portfolio allocation in the Tobin kind of sense, and the other one is basically the financing of the actual investment matter. So that, of course, is not a portfolio discussion. So in the portfolio sense, most MMTers would agree with Tobin and the liquidity preference, but they would not say that the interest rate is driven by liquidity preference, which seems to be implied somehow in Keynes. If you read chapter 17, it's always wobbling that there's yield and interest rate, and there's no capital gain. So Minsky has it more clear, but again, we can talk in the break. Did I leave anything to you? I don't know.
No, I like very much what you said about Keynes. Maybe just to add to that question on post-Keynesianism versus MMT, and I think a lot of people here are a better place to talk about that. But from what I heard from some post-Keynesian guys is like, okay, we've been saying this for 50 years, so, Basel Moore, and then MMT came around, which is basically just putting a sexy label on something that post-Keynesians have been saying for a long time. So I don't think there's such a dichotomy, but I mean, we can maybe have that discussion over lunch, or you want to add to that on the second part, pension and insurers. I mean, most pension funds don't have a banking license, so you can only create money with a banking. That's what you need. You need a banking license. So if you have a pension fund who collects your deposits and buys existing bonds, no money being created. If it's a bank that does it, then yes, money is being created, but again, the money creation precedes the savings, the creation of savings and deposits.
Maybe if you want to
Just
add
very,
something.
very briefly, for me it always means that endogenous money is in the center, and the interpretations of the functioning and further implementations of endogenous money might vary across those different structures, if it's called modern monetary theory, or I'm rather on a structuralist approach of post-Keynesianism. But in the end, we all agree that it's endogenously driven, and there's a strong distinction to the new macro approach of new Keynesianism. When they call it endogenously driven, it might vary a lot. I think that's how we somehow agree. And of course, I think that when what you mentioned, the discussion about the importance of financial sectors and what kind of finance they create, which we not say as investment, but what financial assets in terms of financialization, which is driving up, might then even get a new shape when we talk about the digitalization of the financial sector. Because now when we create new ideas of not banks having that, shadow banking being more important. This is, I think, so far also not covered in monetary theory. So I think that it would be then in the end be maybe called new modern monetary theory or DG or something like that. Because I think that's the next stage.
Actually, this is Minsky's money manager capitalism, which was before shadow banking.
Yeah.
So shadow banking reinvented the wheel, not MMT, which will have to reinvent the wheel.
Okay.
So it's maybe we can leave the last question or comment to Andrea.
May I try to answer the question about how to reform this Stability and Growth Pact? I think there's no need to reform this Stability and Growth Pact. I think what we need is a fiscal coordination above the Growth and Stability Pact. And my message was that the government of money is a political issue, so there's no monetary or financial reason that make it impossible to implement solutions such as, well, for example, your BIBOV has a proposal for the Euro Treasury, which is workable. But one could think of the ECB keeping the public debt that has been purchased with the asset purchase program forever and replace it with certificates of deposits and remove this public debt on an equal share for all countries from the debt GDP ratio that counts into the Growth and Stability Pact. Or you can imagine a 50% cut in the VAT of all countries funded by the ECB. Who else can fund it? Everything is funded by the ECB, as I tried to show. So nothing strange. It's only a political issue.
Okay, I think those were very nice last words for this session. So thank you for attending, and I'll see you again here at 2 o'clock sharp. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry.